Hi friends! Today we are finally getting to part 2 of the basics of drawing hair: textures, volume, and shape. So in my last video posted 10,000 years ago, we talked about basics like starting broad, using line variation, using overlap, and drawing through. In this video, I want to expand on those ideas a little bit to break down how to draw some different kinds of hair textures and styles, and how to apply those to an actual drawing. Also, as a little disclaimer, I'm not claiming to be an expert on this subject. This is just how I draw and break down hair, so you are welcome to adapt it in any way that works for you. This is just how it works for me. Alright, so from the previous video, we already know about drawing larger shapes and then breaking it down into more detail as opposed to starting with way too much detail and really busy lines, and that concept is something that can be applied to any kind of hairstyle or texture. I personally think that straight hair is the easiest to draw simply because there's less to break down. When you're drawing wavy or curly hair, each individual lock is constantly changing direction, and you have to keep that in mind when you're drawing the larger shapes. But with straight hair, it doesn't really have that, or it has it much less, so it's a lot easier to create larger shapes and more kind of flowing locks of hair because you don't have to contend with that texture. This definitely isn't saying that it's a better type of hair to draw because it's simpler, or that there's one style of hair that is better than another. It's simply that you have to think about it differently and break down each style and texture a little bit differently. It's the same principle that applies to learning how to draw pretty much anything, which is you learn the basics, and then once you do that, it's up to you to diversify how you draw by studying how people and things differ from each other and can look different in your drawings. So to get a little more complicated, we're now going to talk about wavy and curly hair using something called the ribbon method. I don't know if it's actually called that, that's just what I call it. But this is a tool that you can use to help you visualize better how a curly strand of hair is formed. The way a piece of ribbon moves and curls is really similar to how hair works. It's just that it's a flat object that you can clearly see the front and back side of, and this makes it a lot easier to see where the shapes overlap on themselves, which can then be applied to drawing an actual strand of hair. Understanding that overlap is what makes curly hair look convincing. It doesn't matter if it's just slightly wavy hair or very tight ringlet curls. The important thing is to be able to visualize that ribbon inside the lock of hair so you can see its starting and finishing point and see that way that strand twists around itself. And then just like with anything else, once you have the understanding of the basics, you can then apply it in different ways. I tend to draw wavy hair that's very irregular, but even though it's not a perfect coil or spiral, you can see where the hair overlaps, and that change of direction is what makes it look wavy, even if it's not completely perfect. Alright, so now let's see how these principles of straight and curly hair can be applied on an actual drawing of a person. As I've mentioned in previous videos, you always have to think about where the hair is coming from. Your hair grows out of your scalp and then gravity pulls it down. So the hair that's visible at the top of your head is going to come out of that scalp and then curve around the skull, and in the case of straight hair, just fall straight down. And since hair grows out from all different parts of the scalp, that's going to be reflected depending on the direction your character is facing. For the front view, you mostly focus on hair that's coming out of the hairline and the front of the hair part, but as you turn the head, you also have to pay attention to hair as it grows along the hair part all the way across the head, towards the apex of the head before it goes over the top of the skull and falls straight down. The same idea applies to drawing curly hair, with the biggest difference of course being that once the hair leaves the scalp, instead of falling straight down, it forms different shapes and sizes of waves and curls and ringlets. And managing that variety of curls or waves tends to be what overwhelms people when they're first learning how to draw curls, because it feels like there's a lot of shapes to work with at the same time. This is why really understanding how each individual section of hair curls is really important, because then you are able to break down the shapes into larger sections of curls, which you can then define a little bit more and add more strand detail as you go. Now keep in mind that I'm only working with one kind of hair pattern in this particular demo, but there are so many different kinds of curls out there. This will vary so much depending on a person's individual hair texture or curl pattern or how they choose to style their hair. And for that reason, you really want to only look at this video as a jumping off point and not a completely definitive way of drawing all types of hair. My goal is to really help you start thinking about how hair actually breaks down and works and behaves, because that way you can apply those concepts to your own work. And one last thing I want to touch on about drawing curly hair is to be very careful about avoiding repetition. By this, I just mean you don't want every single lock of hair to look identical. You want to make sure there's some variation in the direction and there's some variation in the shape of it, so it doesn't look like you just took the same strand of hair and copied and pasted it 50 times. And here I'm outlining a few pieces of hair just to really emphasize that even though this hair might look complicated, it is made up of simpler shapes that you then add to. Alright, so now that we've talked about the basics of drawing straight and curly hair, let's talk a little bit about how that hair moves when it interacts with something else. The first two hairstyles were shorter, so they didn't touch the shoulders or any other part of the body that would affect their direction. But when someone has longer hair, the way the hair behaves changes. Unless the hair is styled a particular way or is tied up or in some other way being held back, it tends to fall down and then follow the contour of whatever it's touching. In this particular example, you can see the hair that falls over the front of the shoulder tends to follow the contour of the chest, so it does curve outward and then down, whereas the hair that has gotten caught on her shoulder folds back in on itself and goes back behind the shoulder, which changes the shape of it as well. Meanwhile, from the rear view, you can see that the hair is falling mostly straight down the back. Once again, the same idea goes for curly hair or wavy hair. You just, again, have to be conscious of the shape of each individual strand because it's going to look different than a straight piece of hair. Even though I am focusing on drawing those individual locks of hair and those individual waves, I am still thinking about the overall shape of the hair and how it flows. So it is broken down into smaller pieces, but especially in the profile view where you can see the hair as it moves over the front of the body, I did think of that overall large shape before I then broke it down into curls, which I then broke down further and added detail to. And the last thing I want to touch on really quickly is just the concept of taking these principles that you're learning and breaking them down so they're simpler or so they work for your particular style. It's really important to understand that even if you are going to draw in a simplified way, understanding the complexities of something make your simple drawings look more convincing. So you can take this kind of hairstyle, just a simple long bob with bangs, and you can recreate that in a simpler way, but you still want to think about the overall flow and the overall shape and the overlap of the hair. You know, you still want there to be nice movement to it, even if it doesn't have the same amount of detail. I know it sounds really cliche, but learning the rules before you break them really does make your art a lot better, I promise. Alright, and that's actually it for this video because in my next video in this series, I'm going to be talking about how to do specific styles like updos, ponytails, buns, braids, that sort of thing. And it's really, really important to have a good understanding of how hair works before you start to style it. So hopefully this video was helpful to some of you guys. If you have any clarifying questions or if there's anything that I didn't talk about that you'd like me to talk about in the next video, go ahead and let me know down in the comments and I will do my best to make it happen. And until my next video, I hope you guys have a great day. Bye!